Back in September of 1987, a botanist by the name of Hugh Wilson, then 60 years old, found himself standing across 109 hectares of badly damaged farmland located on the Banks Peninsula in New Zealand. He made a declaration to his new neighbors. He wasn't going to lay a finger on a gorse. No spraying, no bulldozing, no burning, no cutting. He was going to allow every single thorny, yellow-flowered acre to grow wild and untouched. A letter showed up in the Akaroa Postal Service roughly 2 weeks after that. The writer labeled him both a fool and a dreamer. The letter stated, "Heaven help us from people like him." It went on to warn that the land would be completely destroyed within 10 years, that the gorse would overrun the entire peninsula, and that it would financially ruin every single farm stretching from Christchurch all the way down to the coastline. Fast forward 39 years, and that very same piece of land that Hugh Wilson chose not to interfere with is transformed into 1,700 hectares of thriving native forest. It now contains 47 waterfalls flowing continuously throughout the year, hosts 35 different species of native birds, and stands as one of the most significant ecological restoration case studies anywhere in the Southern Hemisphere. And the gorse? It's nearly disappeared. It essentially destroyed itself. What you're about to hear is the tale of one of the most unusual ecological experiments ever conducted in New Zealand's history, and the reason behind why the botanist leading it never put a single tree in the ground. The property that Hugh Wilson stepped on back in 1987 wasn't simply exhausted. It was in a state of active self-destruction. The farmer who had owned it before had followed every piece of guidance the government had provided. Gorse had been officially designated as a noxious weed by the New Zealand Parliament all the way back in 1900. For the 87 years leading up to that point, the official recommendation had been straightforward: eliminate it. Eliminate it using chemical sprays. Eliminate it using fire. Eliminate it using heavy equipment. And if those methods failed, just apply more of the same approach the following season. That farmer had sprayed the paddocks. He had sent bulldozers up the hillsides. He had manually hacked it back with tools. He had set fire to create break lines along the ridge tops. None of it made any difference. Every single technique the farmer employed only caused the gorse to return denser, quicker, and across an expanding area. Eventually, 53% of the entire property became nothing but a solid canopy of gorse, and the pasture beneath it had completely fallen apart. By the time Maurice White set foot on that property, the farm had already beaten its owner. White was an accountant based in Christchurch who had been quietly accumulating funds since 1977 with the specific intention of purchasing land for conservation purposes to protect native birds. He didn't have any formal training in botany. What he did have was a trust fund and access to a botanist he could bring on board. Hugh Wilson had dedicated 7 years to surveying the plant life around Aoraki/Mount Cook, spent 5 years documenting the flora of Stewart Island, and had recently completed a comprehensive botanical survey of the Banks Peninsula on behalf of the Department of Conservation. He had intimate knowledge of what that landscape looked like before Europeans arrived. That entire coastline had once been covered in dense native forest, running all the way from the mountain peaks down to the ocean. By 1987, however, less than 1% of that original old-growth forest remained anywhere across the peninsula. 99% of what had once thrived there had been wiped out. But Wilson's survey work had uncovered something that the farmers had completely overlooked. Beneath the gorse, in the shade created by those thorny branches casting shadows on the ground, native seedlings were emerging. They hadn't been planted. They hadn't been cared for. They were simply growing on their own. Kanuka, Mayho, Fuchsia, Wineberry, Lemonwood, Five-Finger. These were species that had no chance of surviving in an open pasture, yet they were quietly taking root inside a barrier of invasive weeds. He needed to understand the reason behind this. The explanation turned out to be a biological fact that the farmers had never been prompted to consider. Gorse belongs to the legume family. Just like clover or beans, it has the ability to extract nitrogen from the atmosphere and push it down into the soil through its root system. On land that had been stripped completely bare by 100 years of livestock grazing, gorse is actually the very first plant capable of restoring fertility to the ground, bringing it back to a condition where other vegetation can take hold. It also functions as a fortress in a mechanical sense. A fully mature gorse thicket stands 3 meters tall, is packed chest deep with thorns, and creates a barrier that sheep, cattle, deer, and goats simply cannot pass through. And that fortress provides shade. Hugh Wilson documented this observation in the New Zealand Journal of Botany in 1994. Gorse experiences rapid growth during its initial years, but then it reaches a limit. After approximately 10 years, its own branches start to break down under their own mass. The canopy begins to open up, allowing sunlight to reach the ground below. By that point, the gorse has already enriched and shielded the soil. The gorse plant itself is incapable of regenerating in shaded conditions. It requires direct, full sunlight. However, shade-tolerant native seedlings, carried in by birds and wind, can thrive in those conditions. These native seedlings push up through the deteriorating gorse, grow taller than it, block the sunlight from reaching the original gorse plants, and the gorse dies off. It breaks down and becomes part of the forest floor as compost. The very plant that farmers had spent 90 years attempting to poison was, under the right circumstances, the quickest known pathway back to native forest on the Banks Peninsula. Wilson documented his findings. He sent his letter off through the Akaroa Mail service, and the neighbors declared war. That particular letter calling him a fool and a dreamer was just one of many. Local government rules mandated that Wilson maintain a cleared strip of gorse along the edges of his property boundaries. So he cleared a strip right along the fence line. Nothing more than that. Every single year, the council came to inspect. Every single year, the neighbors observed the inside of the property turning yellow with gorse. One neighbor, a farmer whose family had been working the adjacent valley for 4 generations, later shared with the documentary team that when he was a child in the 1990s, he had visited Hinawawa on an open day and could see nothing except bright yellow gorse stretching all the way to the horizon. Every single farmer across the peninsula was absolutely certain that the seeds from Hinawawa would drift onto their land and wreck everything. Then, in 1988, the Banks Peninsula experienced the most severe drought seen in an entire generation. Cattle were starving on the surrounding properties. The paddocks had dried up and turned to dust. And Hugh Wilson, the botanist everyone claimed was ruining everyone else's future, opened his gate and allowed the neighboring farmer to bring his starving cattle onto the sections of Hinawawa where grass was still surviving. That neighbor went on to become a lifelong friend. For a period of time, he was the only one. In 1991, the Maurice White Trust purchased 870 hectares of the neighboring Otonarito station and incorporated it into the reserve. The amount of work required jumped nearly tenfold almost immediately. Wilson was now responsible for managing over 1,000 hectares of some of the steepest, most isolated terrain on the entire peninsula, and he didn't even own a car. He would cycle the 90-kilometer round trip from Christchurch every 10 days. Eventually, he took up residence in a solar-powered cabin located right on the property. For 9 years, the debate didn't shift at all. The gorse appeared exactly as it had back in 1988. The neighbors remained upset. Wilson continued publishing scientific papers that nobody on the peninsula was actually reading. And then, in 1997, the pattern that the farmers had insisted was impossible started showing up. The gorse in the oldest paddock began toppling over, not across the entire area, but in specific patches where Kanuka and Meho had established themselves first. The canopy started opening up, and native seedlings pushed through into the newly available light. The farmer next door, the very same one who had allowed his cattle to graze there during the drought, mentioned in a later interview that he had originally believed the transition from gorse to native trees would either take 50 years or simply never occur at all. But within just 10 years, he was able to observe native growth emerging in locations where he had no idea any native vegetation existed. By 2016, when researchers conducted the same photo point surveys that Wilson had started back in 1988, the transformation was undeniable. The paddock that had been completely choked with gorse in one 1988 photograph was, in the 2016 photograph taken from the exact same location, now dense native forest, with a Kanuka canopy rising above head height, tree ferns growing below, and absolutely no gorse visible anywhere in the frame. The farmers hadn't been incorrect about how gorse itself behaves biologically. They had been incorrect about how everything else around it behaves. As long as sheep and cattle remain on the land, gorse would continue spreading, and any native seedlings would get eaten almost as quickly as they appeared. But remove the grazing animals, every single one of them, and the gorse transforms into a temporary framework that constructs its own replacement and then disappears. Wilson also eliminated the possums, the goats, and the deer. He prevented fires from entering. Other than that, he did almost nothing at all. He refers to this approach as minimal interference management. In practical terms, this means that the reserve's complete restoration budget over the span of 4 decades has been allocated to fencing, controlling a small number of genuinely threatening invasive species, and trapping possums. Not to planting trees, not to spraying chemicals, not to moving earth. A recent possum trapping initiative conducted across the reserve captured 29 possums over the course of 14 days. Goats haven't been spotted anywhere inside the reserve for more than 10 years. The results, which have been thoroughly documented and peer-reviewed, are almost difficult to fully comprehend. As of 2026, the Hinawawa Reserve spans 1,700 hectares. Approximately 4% of that area consists of old-growth native forest, 6 times higher than the average for the remainder of the Banks Peninsula, which sits at just 0.7%. Around 350 different native plant species have been recorded on the reserve. 35 native bird species have been documented, including 2A, bellbird, brown creeper, rifleman, caribou, and the New Zealand falcon, which naturally returned to the area on its own. 60 different species of fern grow there, 6 of which are tree ferns. 47 waterfalls flow throughout the entire year, a significant increase from just a handful before the forest came back and the hills stopped losing water during the summer months. The reserve now generates approximately $1 million New Zealand dollars annually through carbon credits under the emissions trading scheme, along with additional income from donations and walking track fees, all without a single tree being planted. Wilson's own 1994 paper predicted that by the year 2050, 95% of the reserve would be native forest, 4% would be old growth, and only 1% would remain as scrub or tussock on the exposed bluffs. That prediction was made when the gorse was still standing 3 meters tall across half of the entire property. Every single peer-reviewed survey conducted since then has tracked closer to that original prediction than any other restoration project on the peninsula that relied on the conventional approach of spraying, clearing, and planting. The neighbors understand now. The farmer who allowed his cattle to graze on Hainawawai during the 1988 drought watched as his son began documenting tomtits in his own valley, a bird species his family hadn't seen in that area for decades. Those birds had spread outward from the center of Hainawawai, moving valley by valley as the forest grew denser. Marie Haley, whose family has been farming the adjacent property for 7 generations, now operates guided tours through the reserve. Hugh Wilson is now 81 years old. He continues living in the cabin. He still writes and hand illustrates the reserve's newsletter on paper and sends it out to 2,000 supporters. He has never planted a single tree. There's a photograph included in Hugh Wilson's 2017 paper that was captured from a fixed monitoring location above the Otanerito Valley in October 1988. It displays a hillside covered in pale grass and thick yellow gorse sloping down toward the ocean. Right beside it, taken from that exact same vantage point in October 2016, is a hillside of dense, dark green forest with tree ferns and a Canuka canopy. There is no gorse visible anywhere in the frame. Those 2 photographs are separated by 28 years. Nothing was planted between them. Nobody sprayed anything. The only action anyone took on that specific hillside was choosing not to touch it. If a story like this has shifted the way you think about what land is capable of when it's simply left alone, please subscribe. One of these goes up every single week. Like the video if it was worth your time.